Part 2. The Woman, the Spy, and 90,000 Dead. Previously on Black Namer. A rain-soaked meeting between Eisenhower and Montgomery never happened due to pride and protocol. A German reconnaissance pilot witnessed a strange encounter, his confusion preventing a deadly raid on Allied command. A Belgian resistance fighter named Claire Dubois raced to deliver critical intelligence about a coming German offensive. Her journey ended in an explosion on a muddy road, her warnings dying with her. In November 1944, Major Otto Schultz sat in his cramped Berlin office, a man carrying two identities and one unbearable truth. He was a staff officer in German military intelligence, but secretly he was a member of the resistance who believed Germany could not win this war. After witnessing Stalingrad's catastrophe and understanding America's industrial might, he had concluded that his duty was no longer to the Nazi state, but to the German people who would survive its collapse. He had seen the plans for the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate fantasy that would cost tens of thousands of lives while changing nothing about the war's inevitable outcome. Direct contact with the Allies was impossible, so Schultz became a ghost in the machine. He fabricated Wehrmacht documents with meticulous care and leaked them through resistance networks. He manipulated prisoner interrogations and created breadcrumbs of intelligence, all pointing to the same conclusion. The Germans were planning something massive in the Ardennes, through a web of intermediaries so complex even he couldn't trace them back. He had arranged for critical information to reach Claire Dubois's network information about fuel stockpiling, panzer movements, and troop concentrations in the Eifel region. For one brief moment, Schultz allowed himself hope when word reached him that Claire Dubois was briefing British headquarters. Perhaps someone would finally see the pattern. Perhaps the offensive would be cancelled. Perhaps he could save thousands of lives. When news of Claire's death reached him 3 days later through resistance channels, he understood that his last, best chance to prevent the catastrophe had died with her. He sat at his desk in his Wehrmacht uniform and wept silently, then dried his eyes and returned to work, knowing that in less than 3 weeks, hundreds of thousands would bleed in snow-covered forests because too many small failures had aligned to create catastrophe. December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. 3 German armies totaling 250,000 men and nearly 1,400 tanks smashed through the Ardennes forest. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise against American forces. Many from the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division positioned in what was considered a quiet sector. Entire units were surrounded within hours, thousands captured, defensive lines shattered across a front that Allied planners had deemed too difficult for major German operations. In the first 48 hours, the situation looked so catastrophic that some analysts at SHAEF quietly discussed a general Allied retreat. Eisenhower responded with the decisiveness that defined his command, immediately placing American forces under Montgomery's tactical authority in the northern sector, despite their personal tensions. Montgomery performed admirably once battle was joined, helping to stabilize the northern shoulder and prevent the German breakthrough from achieving its objectives. Whatever their differences over protocol and strategy, both commanders understood their duty when crisis struck. But understanding duty could not erase the cost of unpreparedness. American forces suffered nearly 90,000 casualties in the battle that followed. The 106th Infantry Division was virtually destroyed in the opening days of the offensive. The encircled garrison at Bastogne held out in what became one of the epic defensive stands of the war. But the price was measured in frozen corpses and shattered lives. Throughout the Ardennes, young men from Kansas and Texas and Pennsylvania died, fighting a battle that might have been anticipated if intelligence had reached the right people at the right time, if pride hadn't prevented coordination, if warnings hadn't died on a muddy road. The Ardennes offensive failed exactly as Otto Schultz knew it would. The German army exhausting its last reserves in a desperate gamble that bought nothing but time. American resistance at Bastogne and other key points disrupted the German timetable while clearing weather allowed. Allied air superiority to devastate enemy columns. German fuel shortages, which Schultz's own intelligence reports had warned about, crippled the advance before it could reach the Meuse River. By late January, the Bulge had been eliminated, and the German army in the west was a broken force, incapable of preventing the Allied advance to the Rhine. Schultz survived the war by the thinnest of margins. Fleeing west as Soviet forces closed on Berlin in April 1945, he destroyed his files, surrendered to American forces in Bavaria, and endured perfunctory denazification proceedings before being released. Unlike many German immigrants to Argentina, he was not fleeing war crimes, but rather fleeing from a destroyed homeland and memories too painful to bear. In 1946, he settled in Buenos Aires, changed his name to Otto Schultz, and lived quietly in the San Telmo neighborhood, working as a translator and language tutor. He never married, never spoke of his resistance work, never sought recognition or acknowledgement for his attempts to prevent the slaughter. He read voraciously, followed European politics with an exile's intensity, and played chess every Thursday evening at a neighborhood cafe. In 1963, aged 56, Otto Schultz died of a heart attack while walking home from that cafe, his landlady finding his body on the stairs. His role in trying to prevent the Battle of the Bulge remained unknown to history. Buried in destroyed German records and the silence of the dead, and he died as he had lived in Argentina anonymously, his conscience perhaps lighter for having tried, but still carrying the weight of all those deaths he could not prevent. Montgomery and Eisenhower's relationship remained complicated throughout the war and long after. Each man writing his own version of history in memoirs published years later. In 1958, Montgomery barely mentioned the cancelled meeting, dismissing it as minor scheduling confusion resolved through proper staff work. Eisenhower was more direct in Crusade in Europe, citing the incident as an example of coalition warfare's challenges and the constant need to balance national pride with military necessity. In private conversations during his presidency, Eisenhower was far less diplomatic, telling associates that Montgomery had been one of the most difficult personalities he ever managed, brilliant but pathologically convinced of his own superiority. Yet Eisenhower also acknowledged that Montgomery's careful, methodical approach had complemented the more aggressive American style and probably prevented costly mistakes. Montgomery remained convinced until his death in 1976 that his single-thrust strategy would have ended the war months earlier, that Eisenhower's broad-front approach was a tragic mistake born of politics rather than military wisdom. He believed his genius had been constrained by serving under an American commander whose understanding of warfare was fundamentally industrial rather than intellectual. He never quite acknowledged that his own inability to work smoothly with allies, his insistence on protocol and precedence, had contributed to the very command friction he criticized. Looking back across 80 years at these intersecting lives and missed connections, what strikes us most is how often history turns on moments of pride rather than grand strategy. Eisenhower refused to wait in the rain, and that refusal possibly saved his life while inadvertently disrupting German intelligence planning. Montgomery insisted on protocol and precedence, never knowing his insistence created conditions for a cancelled meeting that would confuse Luftwaffe reconnaissance and prevent a catastrophic raid. Claire Dubois sacrificed herself trying to warn commanders too consumed with their own importance to hear her, dying with intelligence that might have saved thousands, while Otto Schultz worked in secret to save lives, achieving nothing but anonymous failure and dying in exile with his efforts unrecognized. There's a tendency in historical writing to focus on great decisions and strategic turning points, on moments when commanders move divisions across maps like chess pieces, but wars are not won or lost only in those grand moments. They are won and lost in 1,000 small decisions, in pride swallowed or indulged, in warnings heard or dismissed, in the chance timing of a mine on a muddy road. History is made as much by accident and personality as by strategy and resources. The great commanders who shape events are themselves shaped by their egos, their insecurities, their petty rivalries, and their moments of both wisdom and foolishness. The Battle of the Bulge cost nearly 90,000 American casualties, 20,000 British casualties, and comparable German losses in Hitler's final desperate offensive. It delayed the war's end by months, allowing the Soviet Union to advance further west than might otherwise have occurred, and redrawing the map of post-war Europe. The division of Germany, the fate of Poland and Czechoslovakia, the Iron Curtain that would fall across the continent all, were influenced by the timing and circumstances of the war's final months. All of this from German desperation, Allied complacency, and a web of small failures that, woven together, created catastrophe. I think often about Claire Dubois, dead at 27 on a road in France, carrying intelligence that might have saved thousands, mourned by no one except scattered resistance members who would themselves mostly die before war's end. I think about her in that barn at Montgomery's headquarters, watching two generals fail to even meet, understanding with terrible clarity that the approaching catastrophe was partly a product of this very dysfunction. I think about Otto Schultz dying anonymous in South America, his conscience perhaps lighter for having tried, even though he failed, and I wonder whether he knew Claire Dubois had died carrying intelligence he helped provide, whether he added her name to the list of casualties his conscience bore. And I think about Eisenhower standing in the rain, making a decision based on dignity and pride that accidentally saved his life. The bitter irony that a moment of human weakness produced beneficial outcomes no one intended on loss, so one intended of, one of some with so on, one of conover sup of my power of with can a pappen within with above for I have a luck in of a by could a but pump up bull up at for buck but canoe up a walk up move up my above I but was history has no morals, only consequences. And sometimes our failures produce success while our noblest efforts result in tragedy. The threshold of Montgomery's headquarters, where Eisenhower refused to enter, becomes a metaphor for all the small gates through which history passes, moments when pride or principle or simple human stubbornness redirects events in ways no one can predict or control. We remember the generals and their great decisions. We build monuments to their victories. We study their strategies in military academies around the world. But we forget the hundreds of Claire Dubois scattered through history, the anonymous resistors like Otto Schultz, the confused German pilots like Friedrich Hartmann, and the small refusals and minor protocols that cascade into consequence. War reveals human nature in extremis, stripping away comfortable fictions we maintain about ourselves in peacetime. What it reveals is this: We are creatures of pride and principle, of petty grievances and stubborn dignity, even when millions of lives hang in the balance. We want history to be about great men making great decisions, about wisdom triumphing over evil, about courage and sacrifice leading inevitably to victory. But more often, it is about complicated people making human choices, some brave, some petty, most a mixture of both choices whose consequences spiral beyond any possibility of prediction or control. Eisenhower eventually entered Montgomery's headquarters many times before the war's end. They coordinated, they planned, they bickered, and occasionally cooperated brilliantly. They won the war, though not as quickly or as cleanly as might have been possible. The price of victory was paid in blood by young men who never knew why their commanders couldn't manage a simple meeting on a rainy afternoon in November. These soldiers died in frozen foxholes in the Ardennes, never knowing that intelligence about the coming attack had died with a Belgian woman they'd never heard of, never knowing that a German officer had tried to warn them and failed. The rain kept falling on the fields of Belgium, washing away the blood and the mud and the memory of all those small moments when everything might have been different. It fell when pride might have been swallowed, when warnings might have been heard, when human beings might have risen above their pettiness to see clearly the approaching storm. The rain fell on the graves of the known and unknown dead, on monuments and unmarked graves alike, patient and indifferent. It washed everything clean of meaning, leaving only the stubborn facts. So many died, the war was won, and history remembers mostly the names of the proud while forgetting entirely those who died trying to warn them. This has been WWII. This story moved you. Consider the thousands of Claire Dubois scattered through history, the unsung heroes whose warnings went unheeded, whose sacrifices went unrecorded, whose names we will never know. Remember them. Subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. And never forget, pride has a price, and in war, others pay it.